On behalf of the Center for Chinese Studies at UH Manoa, I would like to welcome everyone to our Fall 2022 CCS webinar series. My name is Yu Mingbao Yu from the Department of East Asian Languages and Literatures, where I teach 20th century Chinese literature, film, and culture. And I'm currently also serving as the CCS director and the organizer of this year's webinar series, with the kind assistance of the CCS Executive Committee and CCS Associate Director Renyo Dr. Cindy Name. Today's session is being recorded and will be uploaded to our CCS YouTube channel, where you can also find previously recorded CCS webinar sessions in case you missed them. Our full program flyer for this semester can be found on the CCS website and Instagram, the links of which you can now see in the chat forum. I encourage you all to take a closer look at our program flyer because we have an impressive lineup of presentations coming up, including next week's second talk in our series, Understanding China, that will be a faculty dialogue focusing on China and the world, featuring Wang Huiyao, Dr. Huiyao Wang, who is the founder and president of the NGO Center for China and Globalization. Today's session format will be an interregional and interdisciplinary dialogue on President Biden's Indo-Pacific policy and strategy, featuring Professor Zhiqun from Bucknell University in conversation with UHM faculty. We would like to acknowledge and thank the Department of Asian Studies and the Centers for Japanese Studies and Pacific Island Studies for their co-sponsorship and support. We are indeed delighted and honored that Professor Zhu has accepted our invitation today to share with us his expertise on President Biden's Indo-Pacific Initiative, which is of special importance to our university and the School of Asian and Pacific Studies, or SPAS for short, to which CCS and 7 other Asian and Pacific centers belong. SPAS was recently awarded a $1 million grant to implement this initiative at UH Manoa, and I'm sure you will hear more about it during this panel discussion. Before I introduce my colleague, Dr. Kathy Clayton, who will serve as the moderator of today's session, and properly introduce Professor Zhu and the other panelists, here are some logistical reminders. Please use the chat forum for posting any technical or other queries, but use the Q&A tool for posting comments and questions about today's presentation, which will be answered by our speakers during the Q&A session. Please don't wait until the end to post your questions because then we might run out of time to answer them. In order to accommodate everyone, we kindly ask that you please keep your comments concise and ask no more than 2 questions, so that we keep within the 30 minutes that we have allocated for the Q&A session. We will try to take the questions in the order they have been submitted, but we might also synthesize or group together similar questions so that we save time and make room for other comments and queries. After today's presentation, you will receive a short survey, and we would greatly appreciate if you give us your feedback. And now, let me introduce my colleague, Dr. Kathy Clayton, who is an associate professor and the chair of the Department of Asian Studies at UH Manoa. Trained as a cultural anthropologist, she teaches and writes interdisciplinarily about China, Macau, sovereignty, and nationalism, and their discontents. Her book, Sovereignty at the Edge, Macau and the Question of Chineseness, won the Francis L.K. Hsu East Asian Book Prize from the Society of East Asian Anthropology of the American Anthropological Association. So, without further ado, Dr. Clayton.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mingbao. Thanks for that introduction, and welcome everyone to today's roundtable session on the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy and its implications. We are very lucky to have with us today 3 speakers who will engage in conversation with each other and with you, the audience, about this timely and important topic. First of all, we're honored to welcome all the way from Brisbane, Australia, our primary speaker, Dr. Zhiqun. Dr. Zhu is Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Bucknell University in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. So he is a long way from home today. He was the inaugural director of Bucknell's China Institute from 2013 to 2017, and he was MacArthur Chair in East Asian Politics from 2008 to 2014. He has taught at a number of universities, including the University of Bridgeport, Hamilton College, the University of South Carolina, and the Shanghai International Studies University. In the early 1990s, he was a senior assistant to the consul for press and cultural affairs at the US Consulate General in Shanghai. Dr. Zhu is a member of the National Committee on United States-China Relations and is frequently quoted by international media on Chinese and East Asian affairs. He has authored or edited more than a dozen books, including recently Critical Decade, China's Foreign Policy, 2008 to 2018, and China's New Diplomacy, Rationale, Strategies, and Significance. So we're very happy to have Dr. Zhu with us today. We're also very pleased to have two discussants for Dr. Zhu's remarks. The first is my colleague, Dr. Christy Govella, Assistant Professor in the Department of Asian Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and the director of the newly established UH Manoa Center for Indo-Pacific Affairs. This is really brand new, the center. She is a political scientist whose research examines the intersection of economic and security policy in the Indo-Pacific region. Our second discussant is my other colleague, Dr. Tarsisius Kabutaulaka. Dr. Kabutaulaka is Associate Professor of Pacific Island Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa and erstwhile Director of UHM's Center for Pacific Island Studies. He is a political scientist with degrees from the Australian National University and the University of the South Pacific, who researches, publishes, and teaches about China and Oceania. So the session will run as follows. Dr. Zhu will speak first for around 20 to 25 minutes, and then I'll invite Dr. Govella and Dr. Kabutaulaka to respond for about 5 minutes each. And at that point, we'll open up the session for a more free-flowing discussion among the speakers and among the audience, and with the audience. And as Mingbao mentioned earlier, you can type your questions into the Q&A function little at the bottom of your Zoom screen there. You don't need to wait until the end to type those questions in, but we will wait until after all the speakers have spoken before asking those questions. So when you type the Q&A, the questions into the Q&A function, I will then later go through and read the questions aloud for the people to respond to, for the speakers to engage with. All right. So without further ado, I will invite Dr. Zhu to speak, and I think the rest of us will disappear from the screen while he is speaking, so you can focus your attention on him. Thank you, Dr. Zhu.
Thank you, Professor Clayton, for your warm introduction, and thank you, Professor Yu, for your kind invitation. So it's really a great pleasure and honor to join a group of distinguished Asia scholars at the University of Hawaii to discuss US foreign policy. So the topic today is the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy and its implications for the region. I will make 3 points and leave plenty of time for dialogue and discussion. First, what is the Indo-Pacific strategy? Second, how is the Biden administration implementing the Indo-Pacific strategy? And finally, how have regional countries responded to the strategy and the US-China rivalry? So the first point, the Indo-Pacific strategy. We all know that the United States is a global power, and of course, also an Asia-Pacific power. However, the United States has been traditionally Eurocentric in terms of history, culture, and foreign policy. Barack Obama actually called himself America's first Pacific president and started to pivot towards Asia, a process that President George W. Bush would have started had 9/11 not occurred. Indeed, the United States has been a Pacific nation dating back at least to the mid-19th century, when US commercial interests expanded across the Pacific to Asia. However, today, we actually barely use the term Asia-Pacific anymore. Trump administration officials began to use the term Indo-Pacific in 2017. Then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson actually first used the expression a free and open Indo-Pacific in a policy speech at CSIS in Washington, D.C. In October 2017. Trump himself helped popularize the term Indo-Pacific during his first Asia trip as the US president in November 2017. In Vietnam, he made a speech declaring the US goal of a free and open Indo-Pacific. Since then, officials, diplomats, scholars, and journalists around the world have switched their label for Asia from Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific. It really demonstrates the discursive power of the United States in international affairs. By the way, of course, Indo-Pacific as a geographical concept first appeared in European publications in the 1920s. The United States, the Trump administration actually published its Indo-Pacific Strategy framework in early 2018, which aimed to maintain diplomatic, economic, and military preeminence in the region. The Biden administration largely inherited the Trump administration's Asia policy, although it's taking a recalibrated approach. The Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy was unveiled in February 2022. According to the document, the United States will pursue 5 objectives in the Indo-Pacific. They are: advance a free and open Indo-Pacific, build connections within and beyond the region, drive regional prosperity, bolster Indo-Pacific security, and finally, build regional resilience to transnational threats. Explaining the US shift of focus to Asia, the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy document says, I quote, this intensifying American focus is due in part to the fact that the Indo-Pacific faces mounting challenges, particularly from the PRC. The PRC is combining its economic, diplomatic, military, and technological might as it pursues a sphere of influence in the Indo-Pacific and seeks to become the world's most influential power. The PRC's coercion and aggression spans the globe, but it is most acute in the Indo-Pacific, unquote. The document also says, quote again, our objective is not to change the PRC, but to shape the strategic environment in which it operates, building a balance of influence in a world that is maximally favorable to the United States, our allies and partners, and the interests and values we share. We will cooperate with our allies and partners while seeking to work with the PRC in areas like climate change and non-proliferation, unquote. Now, 2 things stand out if you read the document carefully. First, while Trump emphasized America first and went it alone without working with allies, the Biden administration says we will work with our allies and partners. Number 2, pay attention to the nuances here. In the past, when the United States said we would work with our allies and partners in dealing with issues such as North Korea, China was typically identified as a partner. Today, China is just a pure competitor, not even a partner anymore, even on climate change and non-proliferation. The Indo-Pacific strategy has both security and economic dimensions. To complement the Indo-Pacific strategy strategic framework that I just mentioned, President Biden launched the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF, on May 23rd, 2022. The framework includes 14 members in the Asia-Pacific region. IPEF represents 40% of the global GDP, but does not include China. The proposed IPEF includes 4 themes. 1, fair and resilient trade. 2, supply chain resilience. 3, infrastructure, clean energy, and decarbonization. And 4, tax and anti-corruption. Biden described the initiative as, quote, writing the new rules for the 21st century economy, unquote. So you wonder, how are we going to write those rules without China? And then perhaps we want to impose the rules on China later on? Anyway, that's my first point. Second point, how is the Biden administration implementing the Indo-Pacific strategy? The Biden administration has the general framework of the Indo-Pacific strategy, but specific policies are still being rolled out. Some are already there, and some are being developed. We can use the numbers 1 through 5, what I call the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 scheme, to understand how the Biden administration has been advancing the Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, despite the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Biden administration has continued to focus on China as the most consequential strategic challenge. Russia, by comparison, is considered an acute yet short-term threat. Now, in the Indo-Pacific, great power politics revolves around growing US-China rivalry. The number 1 refers to the fact that the United States is the only superpower in the world today, and it wants to keep it that way, including in the Indo-Pacific region. From the US perspective, only one superpower can exist. The United States will not tolerate the rise of a peer rival, and today China has been identified as the near peer competitor. The rise of China as a non-Western and non-democratic nation is particularly challenging. Now, here lies the structural conflict. China is trying to realize the so-called Chinese dream, basically to restore its past glory as the dominant power in Asia. And the United States is determined to push back any challenge to its dominance. So this intensive rivalry will shape the political economy of the Indo-Pacific region for a long time to come. That's number 1. The number 2 refers to the bilateral alliances the United States has maintained in the region since World War II. This is a so-called hub and spokes structure in which the United States is at the center or hub with bilateral alliances as the spokes, forming a strong security alliance network. The Biden administration has strengthened the US alliance in the Indo-Pacific. The United States, of course, has 5 formal allies in the region: Australia, Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, and Thailand. In addition, it maintains strong partnerships with several other countries, including Singapore, Indonesia, and increasingly India. Obviously, through bilateral alliances and partnerships, the United States has deepened its involvement in the Indo-Pacific region in response to China's rise. The number 3 refers to the trilateral security group called AUKUS. This is a new group comprising Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States that was formed in September 2021. In the words of US Ambassador to Australia, Caroline Kennedy, AUKUS provides a lot of deterrence to China's aggression in the Pacific region. Australia and France actually already had a diesel submarine deal, but the United States and the United Kingdom decided to provide nuclear submarines to Australia. Obviously, France was not happy. That's a different story. Anyway, the AUKUS has raised concerns in the region, including inside Australia. Peace and environmental groups opposed the introduction of nuclear weapons into Australia. And of course, the Chinese government responded by stating that this will seriously disrupt the regional peace and stability, intensifying the arms race and undermining international non-proliferation efforts. Policymakers in Washington, Canberra, and London will probably not consider this as a case of nuclear proliferation, but it will certainly complicate efforts to denuclearize Iran and North Korea. The number 4 refers to 2 things, actually, the Quad and Chip 4. The Quad, or Quadrilateral Security Dialogue among the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, is viewed as the Asian version of NATO, if you like. By the way, the idea of a Quad was first conceived by the late Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in 2007. In a speech while visiting India in 2007, Abe called for a broader Asia, spanning not only the Pacific, but the Indian Ocean as well, shifting away from the Asia Pacific that centered around China. It's interesting, India is part of the Quad. So India has been a leader in the non-aligned movement since the 1950s. So I wonder, by becoming a member of the Quad, India perhaps has violated its long-standing principle, but that's another issue for discussion, not the purpose of this dialogue. The number 4 also refers to the Chip 4 alliance that the Biden administration has proposed as a high-tech group with Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan to secure the semiconductor supply chain and to decouple from China in technology. It's part of the Biden administration's tech war with China. So that's number 4. Number 5 refers to the Five Eyes, intelligence sharing community, as well as the new partners in the Blue Pacific Initiative. Now, Five Eyes is a group of English-speaking nations comprising Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and the United States, which cooperate on intelligence collection and sharing. Can be traced back to World War II, when the United States and the United Kingdom shared intelligence. Now, as the Cold War deepened, the intelligence sharing arrangement became formalized and including more members. Now it has been kind of revived in response to China's rise. Another 5 is the partners in the Blue Pacific, which was recently launched by the United States, Japan, Australia, Britain, and New Zealand, as the 5 countries pursue, quote, more effective and efficient, unquote, ways to deal with challenges from China's growing influence in the South Pacific. So the schemes I just discussed, including 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? 1 superpower, bilateral alliances, AUKUS, Quad and the Chip 4, and the Five Eyes and the partners in the Blue Pacific, capture how the Biden administration has been working with the United States allies and partners to implement the Indo-Pacific strategy. So now to my 3rd point, regional responses to the Indo-Pacific strategy and US-China rivalry. We all know that the Indo-Pacific strategy has 2 dimensions, right? Security and economic. And of course, at the core of the strategy is US-China competition. An editorial of Japan's Nikkei Asia bluntly stated, a free and open Indo-Pacific is a euphemism for containing Chinese influence in the region. Indeed, the Indo-Pacific strategy has raised concerns and put many regional countries in an uncomfortable position. The essence of the Indo-Pacific strategy is US efforts to contain China. Despite US efforts to garner support from regional countries to compete with China, most Asian countries would prefer not having to choose between the 2 great powers. Singapore, for example, has been very vocal in making this position known. Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong has repeatedly told the United States and China, don't force us to choose sides. Furthermore, you guys should fix your problems peacefully and diplomatically. Countries in the region are concerned about the prospect of US-China conflict and prefer to approach China cautiously. Indonesia's defense minister, Subianto, said at this year's Shangri-La Dialogue in June, China has been a leading civilization in Asia. He urged other countries to respect the rightful rise of China. Malaysia's former Prime Minister Muhammad Mahathir criticized the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, as an initiative intended to isolate China, saying, I quote, "Many countries recognize that this is not an economic grouping, but it's truly a political grouping," unquote. In the South Pacific, Fiji's defense minister said, "The biggest security threat in the Pacific region is climate change, not anything else." India, as just mentioned earlier, is an interesting case. It's an emerging power. It's a member of the Quad, but probably the weakest link in the Quad in terms of countering China. Interestingly, India is also a member of BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where it works closely with both Russia and China. So India is trying to maintain good relations with all great powers. India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, said, "India is not sitting on the fence, it's sitting on the ground," meaning India's policies are driven by realism and pragmatism. Now, Japan, I think we can argue that Japan is perhaps the most proactive in working with the United States to counter China. It has been a strong advocate of Quad. Japan plans to increase its defense budget in response to perceived Chinese aggressiveness. Japanese officials, including Prime Minister Kishida, also made analogies between Ukraine and Taiwan and have suggested that Europe and Indo-Pacific security are inseparable. Japan is even considering dispatching civilian defense officials to be posted in Taiwan to strengthen defense cooperation with Taiwan. Now, Australia, of course, as a US ally, firmly stands with the United States because of the shared values. At the same time, China-Australia relations have been strained for a few years. A new government just came to power in Canberra in May this year. Relations between China and Australia have shown some signs of improvement. Defense ministers and foreign ministers from the two countries have met, resuming high-level dialogue that was suspended a couple of years ago. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and Chinese President Xi Jinping may meet next month when they attend the G20 summit in Bali, Indonesia. Now, another US ally, South Korea. South Koreans have coined the term Anmei Jinzhong, or Anmei Jinzhong, which means relying on the United States for security and on China for economic interests. President Yoon Suk-yeol said during a recent interview, even in a Taiwan Strait conflict, North Korea remains South Korea's top security threat, which is understandable given the recent North Korean missile launches. Clearly, he did not want to antagonize China. By the way, President Yoon avoided meeting with Nancy Pelosi when she flew from Taipei to Seoul during that controversial visit in August. I mentioned Chip 4. The Biden administration is struggling to mobilize its allies to participate. South Korea and, to a less extent, Japan are not willing to be overly anti-China. After all, Japan and South Korea trade more with China than they trade with anybody else. So indeed, it's an agonizing for many countries in the Indo-Pacific to choose between the United States and China. Undoubtedly, the United States is vital to the security of the region, yet China is the largest trading partner of most countries. And most countries also have close social, cultural, and educational ties with China. Unfortunately, as US-China rivalry intensifies, these countries increasingly find themselves between a rock and a hard place. So finally, can the United States achieve its Indo-Pacific objectives without including China in the strategy? The question sounds like an oxymoron. If you want a free and open Indo-Pacific, you definitely want to include and work with China, the biggest power in Asia. In other words, you cannot have an open and free Indo-Pacific without China's participation. President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, and other US officials have all said that we are not seeking confrontation with China, and we're not seeking a new Cold War with China. But from Beijing's perspective, the United States is exactly seeking confrontation with China by developing the Indo-Pacific strategy to counter China's rise or decouple from China. It is exactly seeking a new Cold War by forming all these exclusive small groups to contain China. I think that, although China is a peer competitor, the United States still needs to engage China in order to make progress on issues where they have common interests. The challenge for current and future administrations when dealing with China is finding the right mix of cooperation and competition. Regional countries would like to see continued, robust US presence in the Indo-Pacific. There's no doubt about it. But they would also like to see the United States as a uniter, not a divider in the region. I think I will stop here, and thank you very much for your attention and patience.
Thank you, Dr. Zhu. I'm not able to start my video. There we go. Thank you very much for those really very clear, and I think you've stated the problem and the sort of dimensions of the issues really nicely. I like the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 summary. Let's move on. I'll ask Dr. Govella to perhaps begin with some responses. Dr. Govella.
Thank you. Thank you to CCS for having me here today. And it's wonderful to be able to participate in dialogue with colleagues about this really important subject. So I think that we heard an excellent overview of the main characteristics of the Indo-Pacific strategy and some of its subcomponents like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And what I'd like to do is just to kind of offer a little bit of context and a few comments to highlight and perhaps push back against some of the comments made in the presentation in an effort to promote some constructive dialogue. So one thing that I think is important and interesting to note about the Indo-Pacific strategy is that it's really the counterpart to a classified China strategy that exists within the Biden administration and that will never be unclassified, at least in the near-term future. So the Indo-Pacific strategy was really intended to give a vision for what the United States sees as its role and its policy towards the Indo-Pacific beyond the concept of competing with China. So instead of having a policy that was entirely defined in reaction to China, the idea was that this would be a so-called positive vision of what the United States stands for instead of it stands against. I think we heard in the presentation, a lot of the critiques of this and the ways that it is unsatisfying to some people in the region. I would also add that, among all the things we heard, a common critique is that countries don't necessarily feel like it includes the things that really matter to them, like food security, for example, and that trade policy is really lacking. So we talked a little bit about the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, but it really doesn't have market access for Asian countries, which is something that was sought. It really is an effort to replace the now abandoned Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership. It used to be the Trans-Pacific Partnership, now it's the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, with the US left. But when you look at the IPEF and indeed many of the aspects of the strategy, it's not necessarily clear to Asian countries, what they would be getting from US policy. So it was an effort to address that concern, and I think the results have been somewhat mixed. I think it's a great point that China needs to be part of the region in order to address a lot of these concerns. I think the part that's quite difficult is that the cooperation, the scope for cooperation really has become quite small, and that China itself does not seem to be very willing to cooperate with the US, for example, just on climate change or just on other things. So I think on both sides, there are questions about, how we could in fact facilitate this selective cooperation, how we could in fact, get in a situation where we can move forward substantively on improving relations. For example, the Biden administration has talked a lot about the concept of introducing guardrails in the U.S.-China relationship in order to avoid escalation, to avoid conflict. But that isn't really something that China has really been receptive to talking about either. So that is an open question. The next point I would make is that, regional responses really vary quite a lot by country. And I think we heard a really great overview of some of the key differences. And I don't really like the concept of, countries having to choose between the US and China, because I think it is a false dichotomy, in fact, because US-China relations are not the only operative factor in the decisions of actors about how they treat China. And in fact, a lot of countries have connections with China that are not just at the government level, but also between companies, between civil society organizations, individuals, et cetera. And all of them are going to make that calculation in different ways. But I do think it's true that, things have really changed in the last few years. And if we look at India, for example, it was mentioned that India has become more active in the Quad. I actually had the opportunity to sit in on a dialogue with Indian and US and European policymakers in Stockholm in June. And it was really interesting to hear how much the opinion had shifted, in large part because of the India-China border conflict and because of things that have really made India see China as a threat, and a threat particularly in its own neighborhood of South Asia to its relationships with Pakistan, for example. And so I think that, even in the last few years, we have seen a lot of movement also in Australia, also in South Korea, where opinion among the public has been worsening quite markedly in the last year or so. And so it is still true overall that countries don't want to make this choice, which I'd argue is actually a false choice. But I think that things are also moving on the ground recently. So it's not just the US who feels like this. There are, parts of countries that have felt increasingly this way because of being targeted by economic coercion by China, or because of specific border conflicts that they are experiencing. And that also makes the whole region a much more messy and complex place to challenge. The last point I would make is about, this emphasis on small groupings or mini-lateralism. This is something I'm really interested in because I've done a lot of work on regional institutional architecture. And it's interesting that the Biden administration has really taken this viewpoint of basically favoring these small groupings and eschewing the more traditional ones in the region that are larger, or the multilateral ones at the global level, in large part because of frustration that these forums are not able to push forward any meaningful progress on their agendas, et cetera. So one thing that people often say in the National Security Council or in dialogues about the strategy are that they want to let the agenda decide the forum instead of the forum decide the agenda, meaning that they'd like to pick the forum they choose based on the issue that they like to push forward. And so that's why we see a lot of emphasis on these groupings like the Quad, which is seen as a leader level, more efficient grouping in order to push forward things, that matter to the US and to the countries involved, presumably. Of course, this is a problem in some ways, because it is true that you can make progress in these small groupings, but they also do exclude actors of all sorts, not just ones that you may be trying to counter, but also others who may need to help you. And for example, the Quad has really tried to push back against this vision of itself as an Asian NATO, and has really undergone a huge PR campaign over the last couple of years about how it wants to provide public goods to the region and things like health and climate change. But obviously the 4 countries of the Quad cannot solve climate change on their own, and they need to partner with additional countries as well. So whether it's that you're countering countries or that you're, actually trying to just be more efficient about achieving your goals, it is necessary to involve other countries. And that still remains an open question about, the strategy of pursuing things like AUKUS or the Quad or other, small mini-lateral groupings. Because in fact, broad-based support and broad-based participation is necessary from, if not China, certainly a lot of other countries that have stakes in these, but probably China as well. So it is, an open question about this architecture and how it's going to move forward. So this Indo-Pacific strategy, I think, just to sum up, my intervention, is very much an effort of the US to give a positive vision for how it wants to move forward with the region. But when you look at the substance, it very much reveals the challenges that it has, in that the US itself has limited capacity and limited political support for things like, free trade agreements with Asia or other broad-based initiatives. And also that the US feels that it needs to work only with small groups of countries in order to try to push forward its policies, because other larger groupings are not able to talk about them, like ASEAN or the ASEAN-centric forums like the ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asia Summit, et cetera. So I think that in large part, the gaps and the deficiencies in the Indo-Pacific strategy Strategy are very revealing of the current regional situation and where things stand today. So I'll just leave it there for now.
Great, thanks. Christy, I think, Professor Zhu, I'm going to ask you to hold off. Maybe you can respond to both respondents after they've both spoken. Tara, can I turn the mic over to you?
Thank you, Kathy, and thank
Professor Kabutalaka, excuse me.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, Professor Zhu, for the presentation. And also thank you to the Chinese Studies, Center for Chinese Studies for this opportunity. My comments are going to focus mostly on the Pacific Islands, but I want to begin by saying that the Pacific Islands region has in recent years found itself once again at the center of increasing geopolitical competition. The last time it did was during the Cold War era. And because of that, the Indo-Pacific, both the idea as well as the alliances that have been created as part of the Indo-Pacific strategy and alliances, is really important in discussions. And I see the Indo-Pacific as three things. One is that it is a geographical definition of a sphere of influence that stretches from the west coast of the US all the way into the Indian Ocean, and a geographical space that the US defines as their sphere of influence. That's the first thing. The second is that it constitutes a set of ideas, and our speaker has provided some of those, including things like the free and open rules-based order and so forth. And the third is that it's a set of alliances. Some of these alliances are bilateral. A lot of it is multilateral as well, which includes things like Quad, AUKUS, the partners in the Blue Pacific, and more recently, the US Pacific Island Country Partnership. Now, for Pacific Island countries, they suddenly find themselves within the Indo-Pacific. They were never consulted to be included in the Indo-Pacific. And so beginning from around 2017, there was a pushback from Pacific Island countries to being included in the Indo-Pacific, saying that their issues are not the same as that of the US or that of China or any of the major powers. And that central to Pacific Islands issues is the issue of climate change, which was seen as the existential threat for Pacific Islands. And so they came up with the idea of the Blue Pacific, that the Blue Pacific centers climate change. So China was not defined as a threat to Pacific Island countries. In fact, a lot of Pacific Island countries see China as an important development partner, and China as an alternative to the Western partners that they have had for a very long time. And so there was a pushback to that, to the idea of China being a threat to Pacific Island places. And so, in the discussions that led to the establishment of the US-Pacific Partnership last week, one of the issues that came up in the earlier discussion was the inclusion of China in the documents. And some of the Pacific Island countries insisted that they take away the mention of China and just focus on the relationship between the US and Pacific Islands, and the kinds of things that they can do together. And so China was an important factor in those discussions. And the fact that Pacific Island countries, or at least most of the Pacific Island countries, see China as an important development partner. Now, moving forward, I think what will be important in these discussions is the US navigating its relationship with Pacific Island countries who see China as important, but at the same time trying to figure out how they counter the growing influence of China in the Pacific. So 10 Pacific Island countries have diplomatic relations with Beijing, which they see as important. Only 4 of the Pacific Island countries have diplomatic relations with Taipei. And so that's going to be an important discussion that the Biden administration will have to navigate. The second point is, how this will change with changes in US domestic politics, and whether the US government will be able to maintain some of the things that they promised to do in the US Pacific Island Partnership if the Democrats, for instance, lose their majorities in Congress in the midterm elections, or if they lose the US presidential election in 2024. I think Pacific Island countries are conscious of how domestic US politics will be able, will influence the relationship that they have with the US, whereas they are quite clear that relationship with China is unlikely to change in the ways that relationships with the US might change with changes in government here in the US. Anyway, I'll stop here and we'll have discussions.
Great, wonderful, thank you, Dr. Kabutalaka. Dr. Zhu, would you like to respond to comments made by the other two participants?
Yeah, maybe very briefly.
Sure.
Yeah, okay. So thank you both for your very insightful comments, and which actually expanded what I covered. I think that's good. Because Indo-Pacific strategy obviously is a complicated concept. I focused on the competition with China portion, but Professor Covella basically said it's more than that, right? And there are other issues involved, and especially this inclusiveness. Working with small group, other countries in small groups, especially when some existing groups are not functioning well. That's good. I totally agree. But again, my question is, the bottom line here, what will be the ultimate objective of the United States by doing all these kind of things? Are you really think that? Do you really think that China is not the real target here? I think from a realist perspective, there's no doubt. This Indo-Pacific strategy is aimed at China. I don't think we can disagree on that. You also mentioned that this is in response to China's classified strategy. I'm not sure what China's strategy. I don't think China has a strategy here. I think China has this vague, Chinese dream, to restore its global power status, right? I don't think.
Clarify I was meant that inside the State Department, for example, there is a classified strategy towards China in the U.S. government.
In the U.S., okay, I see. Thank you. But you also highlighted a very big problem between China and the United States. That is China's increasing unwillingness to cooperate with the United States, even on climate change. That's really disappointing, And more recently, of course, with North Korea, those are the areas China and the United States should work, and they worked in the past. So it's really disappointing why they're not working together now. And of course, I think this has something to do with the big picture here. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, this global power transition. Again, viewed from Beijing, China is being pressured by the United States and its allies. And that gives Beijing a little incentive to work with the West, with the United States. So that's why we see this unwillingness, on China's part. But of course, we can challenge, is that in China's interest, right? Very briefly, Professor Kabutalaka's point about South Pacific, I totally agree with you. I think, I've spoken to some people from the region, because when China and the Solomon Islands signed a security pact earlier this year, it raised a lot of concern, even alarm here in Australia and the United States. They try to push China out of the region. My argument is that it's not going to work. Why? Because number one, China has already had a sizable presence here in the region. Number two, China's investment here in infrastructure, its help to regional development actually is welcomed by regional countries. So there's no way to. It's not even a good idea to push China out of the region. I mean, have you asked the countries in the region whether they share that idea, right? I think we can agree that the top challenges for the South Pacific are, number one, climate change. Number two, regional development. On both accounts, I think China can actually contribute positively to the region. So why you try to push China out of the region? You can only look at it from this U.S.-China rivalry perspective, because in the view of some in Washington, anything China does is evil. You have to contain China. So if you look at the China that way, I mean, there's no hope for improving U.S.-China relations. My whole argument here is that I'm critical of the Indo-Pacific strategy. I mean, the United States has every right to develop that strategy to counter China's rise. But my argument is that it's going to be counterproductive. It's not going to work. And you are putting a lot of countries in this difficult position. I know Professor Govella said, it's not a dichotomy, it's not a choice. Yes, but the problem is many countries feel they are pressured to make a choice. From Huawei, to 5G, you have to, even Confucius Institute, right? You have to make a choice here. Maybe the United States has not stated clearly, right? But the actions it's taking, the message it's sending are very clear. It's a choice. That's why many countries don't feel like they can do it. And that's why I cited Singapore. I think Singapore as a small country, it's playing a very important role here. It's very courageous, basically, telling the United States and China, look, you guys cannot do that. That's not the way to resolve your differences. You have problems, sit down and talk about those issues peacefully, diplomatically, not apply this Cold War strategy to counter each other. It's not going to work. That's why I really applaud Singapore's effort and that message. I hope that that message is heard by both Washington and Beijing, and hopefully they can sit down and resume dialogue and cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll move, unless Drs. Govella or Kabutalaka want to say anything in response.
If I may very quickly,
Sure.
just reiterate some of the things that Professor Xu mentioned, that from Pacific Islands' point of view, although I cannot claim to speak on behalf of the entire Pacific Islands region, but from my understanding, a lot of people see the Indo-Pacific strategy as an attempt to contain China. And that's the reality. And even the recent U.S.-Pacific partnership is also seen as an attempt to counter China's growing influence in the region. Now, the challenge for Pacific Island countries is managing their relationship with both China and the U.S., because both of them are important development partners, without being entangled in the geopolitical competition between them. That's really difficult for small island countries. And because of that, a lot of them tend to approach these things multilaterally through regional organizations like the Pacific Islands Forum, because collective diplomacy is at the center of a lot of the Pacific Island relationships internationally. Although they do have sovereign rights and they function as sovereign nation states, the regional organizations are important. Now, earlier this year, China attempted to sign a development and security agreement with the Pacific Islands without going through the regional architect, the regional processes and mechanisms for establishing that. And the Pacific Island countries did not reach a consensus to sign that agreement with China. Interestingly, the US and its allies came up with this thing called the Partners to the Blue Pacific. So they took the Blue Pacific idea, appropriated it, and used it as a mechanism for their relationship with the Pacific. And then more recently, the US came up with this idea of the US Pacific Partnership. The US did not go through the same mechanism that the Pacific Island Forum has. However, they signed this agreement with the US. So I think to a certain extent, it demonstrates the power and influence of the US in the Pacific. But again, like I said earlier on, the challenge is really for Pacific Island countries and how they manage their relationship with these two big and very important partners.
Thank you. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Add one quick note. So in terms of the concept of having to choose, my main point was that it's a series of choices made by a lot of different actors, whether it be at the government level, the private sector level, the social level, et cetera. And so, there are, of course, as you move closer and closer to national security issues and strategic industries, for example, there's been increasing pressure on those areas for folks to choose. Despite that, a lot of private sector actors still continue doing business with China, still continue investing there very actively. Those ties are very strong. And the government, even though it has done a lot in terms of talking about economic security and all of these kinds of policies, those are fundamentally, for the most part, the decisions of private actors, whether to invest, what to do, et cetera. So they're trying to reshape those things and to make the choice that, structured in a way that favors the US, obviously. But, it's not as if there's one decision for every country about who they're going to side with, the US versus China, and then that's, decides everything. This is constantly being renegotiated at all levels. And of course, countries have the incentive to get the most that they can from the US and China, because that's, of course, what everybody wants to do. But that's all I was trying to say with that point.
Great, thanks. Maybe we'll move on to some of the questions from the audience. And I think there's a number of questions. Maybe we'll start with this one because it was Dr. Zhu kind of alluded to it, and I get the questions. Some of the questions are specifically addressed to certain speakers, but I will just read the questions out, and those of you, whoever wants to respond, can sort of jump in. So one question is, what is China's Asia-Pacific strategy? We openly see how America's Indo-Pacific strategy is laid out. What are China's equivalent goals and approaches in the region? Where does China make clear its strategy for the Asia-Pacific? While this session addresses the US strategy in that the US has termed China as a strategic competitor, to not include China's strategy in this talk almost seems like the sound of one hand clapping. There's a question for us as to whether the CCS will schedule a session on China's strategy for the Asia-Pacific, but I wonder if the speakers will have anything to say about this question.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not aware of a specific Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific strategy of China. I mean, some people would say, well, China's objective is to get the United States out of Asia. I don't think that's possible. And sometimes you hear that China is willing to coexist with the United States. They keep saying that the Pacific Ocean is wide enough to accommodate two powers. That sounds like, yes, China is willing to share this maybe manage the region with the United States. But I don't think that China has published any specific document stating its position, stating its policy regarding its long-term objectives in the Asia-Pacific region. And we only know that, under Xi Jinping, China is trying to realize the China's dream, and that dream is actually open to interpretation, But basically, I think China is trying to restore its past glory as the dominant power in Asia. What does that mean? Does that mean that China will not allow the United States to continue to be present in the region? I don't think we can draw that conclusion because China has not said anything like that. Again, I don't know. I don't think there's any China's version of Asia-Pacific strategy here.
Sorry, anyone else, Christy or Tara?
If I may, very quickly, I think sometimes people point to the Belt and Road Initiative or the Maritime Road Initiative as China's framework for going out to other parts of the world. And what I notice is that in framing that, people often think that there is a very clearly defined strategy on how to do it. I think that the Belt and Road Initiative is much more messier than people think. That it's not as clearly defined, at least as we've seen it in the case of the Pacific Islands. The other thing is what Dr. Govella mentioned earlier on is that we often talk about China as though it is a single entity, that actually it's much more complicated. In the case of Pacific Islands, a lot of times we are dealing with Chinese companies rather than Chinese state, or we are dealing with Chinese diaspora rather than the Chinese state. And so China's manifestation in other parts of the world, at least in the case of the Pacific Islands, is not monolithic. It is complex and includes a whole lot of different players. So how the Chinese state is able or not able to organize those different players to represent Chinese state interest is not clear to me. That some of those companies, yes, they have connections to the state, some don't. Some of the diaspora Chinese have connections to Beijing, a lot of them don't. A lot of the ones that come to Pacific Islands, come from Guangdong or Fujian provinces and have very little connection to the Chinese state.
I would just add that I don't think that there's not anywhere where we see a comprehensive statement of China's strategies. So a lot of folks, as has been mentioned, put together things like the Belt and Road Initiative or China's own positions on its, territories or towards the South China Sea and all these like different kinds of things, and then they add it up. But China's trend has tended to be to put forward big concepts like, the Global Security Initiative is a recent one, but then the content sort of comes later and gets filled in. And so it's not necessarily clear at the time, which I think is interesting because it means there is flexibility and ambiguity, but I think it also means that it's in the eye of the beholder to interpret what that means. And some people naturally read in the maximalist version of those policies that are about increasing influence in a way that would drive the U.S. out or would force countries to choose, China in the same way that we were just describing of the U.S., while others read much more benign intentions and much more limited spheres of ambition for those policies. So it is challenging, and certain scholars have put forward ideas of what the whole vision adds up to, but there is no official Chinese statement on that.
Thanks. I'm eager to get on to some of these other questions. So there's one question, Dr. Zhu, what role do you see for Taiwan in the US's Indo-Pacific strategy?
I think that question is from Bill, right? Thank you for asking that question.
It is.
Yes. I think, if we agree that Indo-Pacific strategy, at least one of the purposes is to contain China, then obviously Taiwan would welcome it, would embrace it, and will be very interesting in joining it and being part of it. But of course, the United States will have hesitations, right, to include Taiwan because you have this one China issue here, and Taiwan is not recognized as an independent state, and even so on the security dimension, obviously you cannot include Taiwan officially, but even in the economic dimension, it's very interesting. Taiwan is not included in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. However, the United States and Taiwan are working separately to discuss sort of a 21st century free trade agreement between the United States and Taiwan. It's kind of a free trade agreement. So obviously, the United States will involve Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific strategy to some extent, but not, treating Taiwan as a formal ally. Again, this has something to do with this one China policy issue, but of course, the U.S. policy on this issue has changed over the years and has even become a contradictory. But I think to get to the question, I think, Bill, I think, Taiwan definitely can contribute, perhaps even can help the United States to achieve its objectives. If the objective is to contain China, I think it's definitely in Taiwan's interest. But of course, the question is whether the United States wants to involve Taiwan too deeply into this, in case, China will respond violently, if we don't handle the Taiwan issue carefully. So I think Taiwan is in a very delicate situation here.
Thanks. Tara or Christy, do you have anything to say about Taiwan? No.
I would just say that, aside from Taiwan's direct involvement, obviously the situation in the Taiwan Strait is of key concern to the Indo-Pacific strategy and is behind a lot of the language that they talk about when they talk about promoting stability, et cetera. So it's definitely in there. And yes, the question of Taiwan's direct participation is one thing, and it's clearly framed as part of the threat that is to be avoided.
Thanks. Dr. Zhu reminded me that I should be perhaps attributing the questions. So that first question about the Asia-Pacific strategy was from James Corcoran. The question about Taiwan was from Bill Sharp. And we have now a question from Miriam Stark, who says, thank you for this presentation. As someone who works in Southeast Asia, I cannot help but note that only Singapore is consistently mentioned as part of the dynamics that currently drive the Indo-Pacific strategy. Could both Drs. Zhu and Govella talk about how this strategy will play out across Southeast Asia beyond the Belt and Road Initiative, and which Southeast Asian countries beyond Singapore will be key players? Dr. Zhu, to you first.
Well, this this goes back to the point, whether US or China is going to unite the region or divide the region. You look at the Indo-Pacific Strategy or Belt and Road Initiative. Depending on how you look at it, some countries will welcome those initiatives. Others will be hesitant, and yet others will probably oppose it. All right, and the ASEAN nations are not unified in terms of their policy towards the United States, towards China. Singapore is mentioned, because Singapore has been very vocal, but other countries are less vocal, but doesn't mean that they don't have any concerns. Actually, I mentioned Malaysia and Indonesia. These countries are to a large extent share the concerns from Singapore. Vietnam also, right? You want to deepen the security and economic relations with the United States, but at the same time, Vietnam is right next door to China, and obviously Vietnam also wants to maintain strong relations with China, not just for political, economic reasons, but also even perhaps for ideological reasons, right? Both are still communist states. With other countries, Laos, Myanmar, Cambodia, apparently are pretty much on China's side. They would sign on to any Chinese initiatives, and they welcome Chinese investment. So the whole region is very diverse. I don't think we can use one phrase or one pattern here to describe what each of these countries is thinking about China or the United States. Singapore happens to be the country that is speaking out, but others obviously have their own interests in mind.
Thanks. Christy?
So that's a really important question about the role of Southeast Asia. I guess to speak strictly from the perspective of the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy, certainly a target audience of this was the countries of Southeast Asia and also the Pacific, although as my colleague mentioned, whether the Pacific wants to be involved in that is a totally different question. But I think the idea was that the US very much under the Biden administration has this realization that they cannot do things unilaterally in Asia. And so therefore the support of their allies and partners and also other countries in the region, especially the countries of Southeast Asia and the Pacific, is crucial. And so a big part of this strategy was an effort, as I was saying, to sort of win over the sentiment or gain support from the region. In terms of how it would affect them and how they would play roles, I think it's pretty complicated because in some ways, Southeast Asia could be seen as a beneficiary of competition with China because, for example, if trade is diverted or production or investment are diverted from China, then they could find new homes in Southeast Asia. And we have seen that already happening for the last decade with companies choosing to make China plus one investment strategies, which had often included ASEAN countries like Vietnam, for example. And so I think that's one way that, countries can both sort of by default and also intentionally benefit is to try and reap some of the shifting benefits that are going away from China to them, which could provide benefits. On the other side, it really just depends on the particular country and what opportunities and challenges it faces. Obviously, those countries that are feeling more stressed by China, such as ones that have territorial disputes with China or that are having gray zone conflict with China, they feel in some cases, again, not across the board, but it may benefit them to participate in certain parts of the Indo-Pacific strategy or initiatives like defense capacity building for maritime security, building up coast guards, things like this. But again, it doesn't involve taking, the whole package as such. In order, you don't have to side with the US on all things. You can pick and choose. So for some countries, this means trying to get economic benefits, others security benefits. And I think, across the 10 ASEAN nations, you see pretty diverse reactions, and also these change over time. And the Philippines has been an example of a country that has, had changing policy and has moved perhaps more towards China, although really its behavior did not change that much, despite the rhetoric of President Duterte. But I think it just really was quite different. I think all you can say in general is that each country is trying to get what it can and also protect its security while also not making itself more vulnerable to strategic competition or the wrath of China for accepting US aid.
Great, thank you. Let's move on to the next question from Maya Bonilla, who asks, my question pertains specifically to the Pacific part of the Indo-Pacific structure. What is the US's role in developing regionalism in the Pacific? So I think Dr. Kabutalaka, you had talked about the Blue Pacific and other sort of regional, visions or perhaps infrastructures in the Pacific. And what role do you think the US has in developing, if any, in developing those structures?
Thank you for the question. I think it's the other way around, that there is a possibility that the competition between China and the US, and particularly US increasing involvement, could undermine regionalism in the Pacific. So both China and the US are what they call the post-forum dialogue partners. So they come to the Pacific Island Forum meeting. They don't actually participate in the meeting, but they participate in the dialogue afterwards. And what we've seen is that both China and the US have, at least in the last year, tried to gain support, to rally support from Pacific Island countries for their initiatives without going through the regional processes. And that's what I mean by saying that could, in the longer term, undermine the collective diplomacy that is foundational to regionalism in the Pacific. If the US begins doing its own thing on the side and trying to pull some of the Pacific Island countries to join them, while China doing similar things, that could pull the Pacific Islands Forum apart. Earlier, in the last 2 years, we've seen 5 of the Micronesian countries threaten to pull away from the Pacific Islands Forum. Now, this is not directly connected to geopolitical competition, but I think that geopolitical competition could also contribute to such divisions in the region. Kiribati has left the Pacific Islands Forum. Now, that's important because Kiribati wasn't in Washington, D.C. to sign the US-Pacific Partnership that they had last week. And so it raises the question, where does Kiribati fit in here, and what could China do in their bilateral relationship with Kiribati that could, create more competition with the US or undermine the Pacific Islands Forum? I'm not sure that answers your question, but what I'm basically saying is that I don't see the Pacific Islands as, the US as strengthening Pacific regionalism. On the other hand, on the contrary, I see US increasing involvement and China's involvement as potentially undermining regionalism.
Thanks, Tara. Christy or Zhiqun, do you have any responses to this question about the US and the Pacific?
I would just say that to echo that comment, that this is part of what I was talking about focusing on smaller groups of countries in ways that people do fear are undermining the more established, organizations. So in the Pacific Islands Forum case, that's one thing, but also, we could make the same argument about ASEAN or the ASEAN Regional Forum, that, really the dialogue should be going through those established forums, but instead this small country approach does create some tensions in terms of how the other established organizations function and what overall cooperation looks like.
Great, thank you. I think there's one question that I'd like to combine with a question of my own, and that is about the role of history. I'm currently working on a project about the Cold War, 1950s, 60s in Macau, and I'm always struck by some of the parallels, some of the differences. The Cold War has come up a few times as either a narrative for understanding these kinds of rivalries, or perhaps there were actual sort of infrastructures or alliances that were existing in the Cold War that are sort of roaring back to life. And so my question is about sort of what role do you see history of the Cold War playing in the way that actors are thinking about what's going on now? And then James Corcoran in the question asked about perhaps the sort of the haunting presence of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere of the 1930s and 40s. So I wonder if any of you, that's a little bit maybe kind of out of left field, but I'm wondering if any of you have anything to say about this question of what are the historical legacies? What roles are the historical legacies of these earlier forms of regional and transnational interactions playing today? I'll open it up to whoever wants to go first.
I'll go first just to break the silence, and
thank you.
My colleagues can contribute more. And I want to begin by saying that the U.S. oftentimes, particularly Washington, D.C., when they talk about their relationship with the Pacific, they often frame it as partners since the Second World War. And now that's problematic because it's coming from this narrative of the U.S. as a liberator in the Pacific. We came, we liberated you from the Japanese, therefore we are good partners. It's problematic on a number of levels. One is that the Second World War was traumatic for Pacific Island places, both places and people. And so I'm not sure it's a good place to start. That Pacific Islanders found themselves at the center of a war that wasn't theirs. And a lot of their places were destroyed. And a lot of people were killed. And many people continue to be killed in places like Solomon Islands because of unexploded ordinances from the Second World War. So I'm not sure that framing it from the Second World War frame is a good idea. The second thing is that historically, the U.S. involvement in the Pacific has been traumatic. If you look at U.S. nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands, and I know that at the moment they're having the discussions to renew the Compact of Free Association Agreement, the Marshall Islands has stalled on that. And one of the reasons is that they want the U.S. to address some of those things. The U.S. was involved in nuclear testing in Johnston Atoll. And so, so the U.S. comes to this relationship with a baggage. It comes with a history because of its past involvement. Beijing has the privilege of coming to this relationship without that same history. And so people see China perhaps as a different new partner, whereas the US as a partner that we've had for a very long time, but a problematic partner. Not sure that answers your question, but I'll just throw it out there.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really interesting point.
I'll just chime in with a few thoughts on a very, very large and important question. I mean, I think the historical context is key, and obviously it shapes the reactions that all of the countries in the region have to both the actual geostrategic dynamics and to these kinds of strategies or statements. It very much, colors the way you read any statement of intention that's made by one of these great powers. With respect to the Cold War comparison, it is a very different situation in a lot of ways. I mean, a key one is that the US and the Soviet Union were never economically integrated in the way that the US and China are now, of course, and the way that China is with the entire region. So a lot of that approach is, even if they wanted to institute it, would not work well. Discussions of decoupling are always rampant everywhere, basically. But, there are some real questions about what that would look like. And it seems like the most realistic outcome, if any, would be very selective decoupling in strategic industries, et cetera. And even that will probably encounter a lot of resistance. So I think that the overall rhetoric and some of the dynamics share characteristics in the sense that we see rivalry between two great powers. But I also think that a lot of the details that are crucially important are quite different. And being somebody that focuses more on political economy issues, that tends to operate in most of my time. So but it's crucial to think about how they are framing the issues, because that itself and this idea that it is a new Cold War shapes the policies that we see. With respect to the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, obviously that's also in the minds of, all of these things are in the minds of countries who have felt manipulated by other powers, or who have felt like they were victims of dynamics that were really not about them in the past, or misled by good intentions. So I think that, with respect to Japan specifically, there is still that legacy in the region sometimes when they become involved, and has been, hanging over them. And obviously, most particularly their near neighbors of Korea and China have been most upset about historical issues, but a lot of the direct historical fallout still is present in the region. So with respect to Japan, some suspicions still linger, and especially when Japan tends towards becoming more, if not militarized, more active in the security sphere with what they would like to call proactive contributions to peace. Sometimes that similarly is read with, suspicion by other countries in the region who recall what that, may have looked like in the past. So it's crucially important, if only that it, not only for the regular dynamics of what's happening, but also in terms of how things are interpreted and put forward.
Thank you.
I'm just going to say that if there's any lesson that we can learn from history, that is that all countries, especially great powers, United States and China, should do everything possible to avoid war, either Cold War or hot war, because there will be no winners, especially in the nuclear age. So I'm encouraged to hear that, both the United States and China are saying that, we're not interested in a Cold War, but I think their words and deeds should match. I think they really need to work together instead of treating each other as the enemy. Then maybe war will become inevitable. So I think this is the painful lesson we should learn from history.
Right, especially because the Cold War wasn't cold in many parts of Asia and the Pacific, so we would hate for that to happen again. All right, I think we are at basically at the end of our time and of our questions. Do you have any final summations, thoughts you'd like to share with the audience? I think ending on that note of, hoping for cooperation and to avoid war is a great place to end. And so on that note, I will thank the panelists, especially Dr. Zhu, for their comments and participation, and also Drs. Govella and Kabutalaka. I'd like to thank the audience for your great questions and your attention. And we hope to see you at future talks in this series. I think you will be, Cindy, will they be seeing what the next talk is? Are you going to post that? Yes, she's just posted it in the chat. The next CCS webinar will take place 1 week from today from 2 to 3 p.m. So 2 to 3:30 p.m. So thanks again, everyone, and have a wonderful week. We hope to see you again soon.